Okay, is it recording? Yep, it is. Excellent. So today I learned that my childbearing hips are a little too wide for my son's gaming chair that I'm borrowing from him. Okay. So it's question and answer time again. Let me set up a timer so I don't take up too much of y'all's time. Okay, where is my thing? Timer. Oh, there it is. Okay, delete. Okay, so we'll see how much time it takes me. So, bridging empiricism, materialism, and then scientism. So the book states that Mill, on one hand, refused to depart from the strict empiricism, but on the other hand says that his empirical psychology was not of the radical sort, saying that psychology can be an exact science even though its findings are hypothetical. I'm a bit confused by how this is, considering Mill's strict empiricism, or if I'm misunderstanding what the text is saying about Mill. Actually, I think you've got a pretty good handle on the complexity of what it is that Mills is facing. Mills came to realize through his research that human beings and predicting human beings is always already going to be approximate. So what certainty we can have about what human beings are doing and what it is that they're about needs to be based on empirical evidence. However, it will always already be incomplete. So a bad metaphor, but the best one that I can come up with on short notice, is predicting the weather. When it comes to predicting human beings, it's more complex even than the weather. So when we think of predicting the weather, like here in Utah, we're having kind of November-y, December-y weather sometimes, even in the spring. Heck, we can have fall-like temperatures in the summer and then suddenly summer-like temperatures in the winter. So how do you predict those kinds of differences and those kinds of atypical weather patterns? And the answer is by looking at it systemically. Where the highs and lows are in other parts of the country, meaning high pressure and low pressure areas, where the wind is going, where the jet stream is, where the jet stream's coming from, where these high and low pressure areas are coming from as they unfold, that all of that is a dynamic process that meteorologists need to take into consideration when they are predicting how the weather will be. Human beings are seemingly more complex still. That on the one hand, we all have our seasons of behavior. You know, there's a certain set of behaviors you usually engage in when you get home from school or from work a given day. You know, kick off your shoes or turn on the TV or whatever it is that you do. And so, like with other seasons, there are degrees to which we can predict that. But what all goes into how it is that you behaved at the club last week or on that date, your first date, or how you drive in traffic, all of that is systemically related to all of the other things that have not only happened to you historically, but are happening with you right here and right now. So Mills keeps backing us into an empirical science, or a seeming empirical science, while at the same time offering that as a model of certainty. And then he also humbly argues that it's only ever a matter of proximity. So that brings us to a point, and this actually is going to touch on a bunch of the questions that you guys asked. Okay, let's talk about logical positivism. Okay, because John Stuart Mills is heading us in that direction quite quickly. Mills acknowledges that there are phenomena of human beings that he cannot or we cannot measure directly. In our classes, we've harped on some of these things repeatedly as examples of how it is that empiricism is still open to criticism, that empiricism is not the only answer. So one of those examples is personality, and we've harped on this a lot, so bear with me while I pluck this one string again. Your personality is not directly empirically observable. Meaning that if you're sitting alone in a chair, there's nothing there that I can measure. I can measure your height, your weight, the chair that you're sitting in. I can do a lot of things, but I can't measure your personality. And so I can't directly empirically observe that. It seems to be interior to you at that particular moment. And so therefore, I will then put together a website and I will ask you questions that from your point of view about your tendencies of responding in certain scenarios and in certain ways. So as you are clicking through my website and the program working behind the website is adding up the points for various types of personality that I've pre-theorized, then at the end when you hit go and it spits out you are this type of personality, or here are the personality scores that you score high on, so you're this kind of personality. So like if it used to be the Kiersey was online, which was a version of the Myers-Briggs, you're an ENFP or an ISTJ or whatever else, that there is something going on that is counting up those marks that you've made on the website, and it gives you a particular report at the end. Now, I cannot directly observe your personality empirically, but what I can empirically observe and count are the number of marks that you made on this particular website, the number of buttons you clicked, and in what order you click them, and to what degree on a scale that you tended to click a higher degree of something and a lower degree on others. So Mills, on the one hand, is trying to keep the certainty that comes with empiricism while still pushing into that middle ground that there's a lot of things that we can't directly observe. And I know this gets really confusing. So how can we be certain that the personality report that you get after clicking through my website is the personality that you actually have? Well, we have two parts of this. One is positivism and the other is logical positivism. So positivism is the philosophy, and John Stuart Mills helped develop this philosophy, that we can find constructs that are related to a construct we cannot empirically observe, and we operationalize, that's a big $10 word, operationalize, that we operationalize this particular construct in such a way that we can find like phenomena that we can measure, that if we measure those phenomena, that we can have some relative degree of certainty that we are measuring to a degree the phenomena itself. So when it comes to personality, I cannot directly measure your personality. So what it is I operationalize personality as questions on a website, and the number of clicks as an increase or decrease in the probability that you have one personality type over another. And therefore I can be positive if I've operationalized my questions well, that I'm in a way measuring your personality. Okay, this is very confusing. And so likewise we do things with intelligence tests, that I cannot measure your intelligence directly. So what I will do is I will operationalize intelligence as a series of word puzzles, number puzzles, actual puzzles, and I will time you as you complete these puzzles. And the quicker you do them and to the greater degree of accuracy you do them, then I would say, okay, that shows that you have a higher and higher intelligence. Even though I'm not measuring your intelligence directly, I am measuring the things I can measure, which is you're clicking on pages on websites, etc. Okay? So I hope that makes some sense, that we do it with IQ, we do it with personality, we do it with Gryffindor House, are you a part of, which Marvel Universe superhero you're most likely, what your Dungeons & Dragons alignment is. There are all of these things that we do where we operationalize it. Likewise, think in terms of your relationships. How do you know that your partner loves you? How have you operationalized it? Now, some of you don't. You take it on faith, or you experience love phenomenologically. Others of you, and I'm not recommending you do this, put your love to the test, where you operationalize love in certain ways, the number of gifts given, number of words of affirmation expressed, etc. And the more of those numbers there are, the more certain you are that your partner loves you, okay? All of this relies on this philosophy of positivism, that we can operationalize something that we cannot directly detect, empirically detect, into something we can empirically detect, and then measure that instead, okay? Now, you're right, that is resting on a whole raft of assumptions, and some of you are pulling out your Occam's razor to cut this raft and let it sink. And it's a struggle, because how can we know that we've operationalized it well? That's why psychologists in particular are so very worried about what is called external validity. Okay, external validity, if you remember from your research methods class, is the validity that you are indeed measuring what it is that you purport to measure. So, if I am saying that I'm measuring personality, I'm measuring it in a particular way, how can I be sure that I'm measuring personality? Well, two things. One, other experts on personality have read through my test, and in their opinion, they say that yes, it is. And I correlate my test with other similar tests or other different tests, and I need to correlate, and my correlation coefficients need to show that it has a strong enough correlation to other measures that purport to measure what I do, and a significantly low correlation or negative correlation with measures that I am arguing my measure is very different from or opposite to, okay? So that's external validity. And so Mills is aware of these kinds of conundrums, these kind of problems. Now he just starts the ball rolling, right? This is early in the pseudo-empirical, logically positivistic mode of psychological science. He's pretty early on. We developed these terms after Mills as a profession. And so where does the logical of logical positivism comes in? Well, simple logic, that if I have operationalized my construct correctly, and if my measure has external validity, then I can logically conclude that this is as close as I'm going to get, or can get, to measuring the actual phenomenon in question. So that's where the logical of logical positivism is. It's back to emphasizing the external validity of the test. So it is confusing. There are these efforts to hold on to psychology as an empirical science, while, based on the legacy of Mills, what we are doing is still holding on to rather Cartesian methods within our empiricism, right? When you look at the logic and logical positivism, it really seems to reflect Descartes' hypothetico-deductive method, that although psychology wants to be empirical, we're awfully rationalistic about it. And of course, on top of that, there's all the ways in which we deny as a field how deeply socially constructed everything we do actually is, and how that throws empirical certainty out the window to a degree, or to a large degree. So what we have with Mills, to reiterate, is this confusion that reflects his own realization of the struggle, that he would like the phenomena of psychology to be as certain as empirical phenomena are. At the same time, though, there are so many phenomena about human natures and the complexity of our behavior that you cannot be certain just watching, just by empirically counting. And there are some things that aren't empirically observable and countable. So therefore you have to use these other methods in order to approximate empirical certainty. So his empirical psychology is not radical, right? Because he keeps backing into these more rationalist processes like logical positivism. At the same time, though, he is still considered an empiricist because his certainty, or his proximity of certainty, still arises from that which you can directly observe, even if it has to be operationalized for you to observe it. So I hope that helps. It's like he's tempering radical empiricism of his forebears by saying, we can't count a lot of things in psychology. Like, empiricism works great when you're describing rocks and trees. Works better when you're describing rocks and trees than it does when you're describing why it is that Johnny keeps wetting the bed and he's 12. Like, that requires a different way of sciencing than why it is that the bottom half of my pepper garden doesn't grow fruit as fully and as richly as the top half of my pepper garden. It's a different kind of question. So it requires a different way of methodizing and thinking about it. Okay, another question. How might Mill's psychology be different if he embraced deontology, like Kant's categorical imperative? Wow, that's one of those big mind-blowing questions, guys. That's okay. So let's review. Deontology. Deontology is the philosophy, normative ethical theory that morality and action should be based on whether or not the action itself is right or wrong underneath a certain set of rules, rather than based on the consequences of the action. So this really changes Mill's theory up markedly. Right? That's why this question is so important. Mills did not take anything up as fundamentally ethical apart from the outcomes. Right? He's very utilitarian, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So if he had took up certain, in fact, I'm going to really confuse this here in a second. If he had taken certain things up as good from the outset, and that there are rules about what makes something good, then how would have his ethics unfolded accordingly? One of the things that we get to wonder is, given that he is trying to be as empirically, or in Mills's case, logically, positivistically, as scientific as he can be, is science and scientism compatible with deontology? And it seems like the answer is no. And then, of course, I'm going to complicate it here in a minute. That the truth claims that we make, or knowledge that we have, insofar as our knowledge is valid, comes out of direct observation of our environments, according to empiricists, put in a certain way, right? And so therefore, deontology means that there was always already existing a certain set of rules within a given set of behavior that determined whether or not that behavior was right or wrong. And so there are things like Christian deontologies or religious deontologies. Let me silence this so you guys don't hear my notifications going off. That, like, I remember as a kid asking my father a very important question. My father is a theologian and a pretty sophisticated one. And I was a child, and I asked my dad, I was like 10 or 11, and I said, "Dad, why is it that if I sin once, I tell a little white lie, I am now fundamentally in the category of sinner according to the deontology," I didn't use the word deontology back then, but according to the rules of this religion, according to the commandments. And my father tried to get me to show that there are certain rules, and that by breaking those rules, you are now a rule breaker. There's no way to not be a rule breaker. You've broken one rule, you are now in the category of rule breaker. And I said, so it doesn't matter the amount of good I bring in, the amount of honesty I bring into the world. Instead, that I am now in this category of fibber, a white liar, because having done it once, therefore that is what I am. And he said, yes, yes, indeed, and gave some other examples. And I said, okay, why? Why is it that one action condemns me forever, and therefore I need to have a salvific figure in a Christ or a Jesus, atonement, sacrifice, covenant, etc.? Why? And he tried to help me understand various models of the atonement within Christianity, and how it is that the sin that I brought into the world by lying could be redeemed through these various philosophies of the atonement, which I appreciate. It was very informative. At the same time, though, I said, well, why is it that I'm in the category of sinner? Why is it, having done one thing, I am that thing that I did and nothing else? That no amount of good deeds, no amount of living kindness or grace or honesty or whatever else will ever remove that category of me as a sinner. And my poor dad just gave up and threw his hands in the air and said, it just was, right? There was a law irrevocably written in heaven before the world was. And then, of course, not taking the hint that Dad was sick of talking about it at that point, I asked him another question, and that is, well, who wrote those rules? Okay, so what Kant tries to do is Kant tries to use reasoning, observation, right, his philosophy, to argue that there is a certain set of ethical rules we should always already be following. And he's not doing it in a Christian way while saying, well, Jesus said so. Instead, he is taking that same Christian deontology that there are certain fundamental rules for being and certain ethical rules for being, and he is now stepping outside of Christianity and then supporting many of these same rules. Okay? So what would have happened if Mills had been deontological? Well, if Mills had been deontological, rather than him looking at ethics as outcome, meaning that is a set of behavior ethical or unethical, it depends on the amount of good or harm that it does. And if a given set of action or actions provides more benefit than harm, then it is more ethical than not. And if it provides only benefit and no harm, then it is very ethical. And if it provides only harm and no benefit, it's very unethical, etc. That instead he would look at it from the outset as here are certain rules, and here are how you follow those rules, and I will look at human behavior according to the rules pre-generated. And so, therefore, he cannot empirically justify the moral rules, the ethical rules that he would have to assert in his observation. Therefore, like Kant, he would have the challenge of justifying those ethics in order to argue for the certainty or argue for the proximity of his conclusions. I tell you what. Now, as confusing as that is, or as confusing as that may be, let me confuse it even more. What if utilitarianism is itself a deontology? Yeah, sit on that for just a minute. Like, what the hell do you mean, man? Right. What the hell might I mean? Okay. Mills posits that the amount of good or benefit, right, he's very practical, he's very pragmatic, it's the goods and benefits that come out of a given set of behaviors that determines whether or not the behavior is more and less ethical. But you notice that term good, the largest amount of good for the largest amount of people, how that good is defined shows a certain set of pre-existing assumptions. Okay, and it's very common in the field of psychology that we have certain assumptions going on about what good is and what bad is. And so therefore, it's okay, Lou. I know it's weird, I'm in here talking to myself. Yeah, good girl. You're such a good girl. That our assumptions about good seem to presume a certain deontology. That Mills didn't have to break down why it is that people surviving or being more healthy was a good. That is a presumed deontology, that we have this assumption that those things are good. Now, let's say somebody comes at philosophy psychology with a very different philosophy, and that is harm done to the right people in the right manner is good. That would really change our utilitarianism, right? It would become like an anti-utilitarianism if we assume the good of harm. And so by assuming the good of health and prosperity and longevity and living, that seems to assume a deontology, that is a good built into the world, and that things are ethical insofar as they facilitate more of that, or not insofar as they don't. And so maybe there's a subtle deontology with Mills and perhaps the rest of psychology. So Mills' theory would look very much like a rationalist theory, an openly rationalist theory, where he would keep retreating to reasoning to provide certainty for his conclusions, rather than retreating to empirical or logically positivistic observations to assert and to justify the certainty or approximate certainty of his results. Which leads us to the next question. What is the relationship between egoism and utilitarianism spoken of by Mills? Okay, well, that's a good question, and it relates to the previous two. When it comes to egoism, let's bring up our definition so we're on the same page. Egoism is the tendency to believe that human beings are contained within their egos, that we have our point of view, our preferences, our way of liking things, and that the truthfulness of those things is up to us and within us. And so, therefore, egoism gives rise to individualism. This belief that we are relative to our preferences are relative to us, would be a better way to say that. So So, because we have our own personal preferences, sorry, my eyes are itching, it's allergies. So, because we have our own personal preferences, we are motivated by our own self-desire and own personal wants and needs, right? We are isolate monads. There's nothing fundamentally connecting us to the world, and therefore any activity we engage in is interiorly generated. And in egoism, they often assume that a lot of our behavior is motivated by the need for our own satisfactions. Our satisfactions for, hungry if we eat, sex if we're horny, sleep we're tired, that it is for personal and ego reasons that we do everything that is we do. So egoism is often seen as either intense relation to altruism, or is antithetical to altruism. So Mills is arguing that what is ethical is the largest amount of good for the largest amount of people, that a given activity is ethical if it's the best in terms of health, wellness, living for the largest number of people in that particular scenario. So the trolley car problem, right? There's a trolley car and it's wheeling out of the way, and you can pull a lever and it'll either hit your best friend or go through and kill 12 people you don't know. Do you pull the lever or not? And the endless ethical debates there. For Mills, it is you pull the lever. It's better one person suffer than a whole bunch of other people. And so, whereas an egoist would say, no, what is best is what satisfies your personal interest, what satisfies your needs. If you are indifferent to the life and existence of these dozen people the trolley car will hit, then you pull the lever because you love your friend, and therefore the trolley car goes through the crowd and kills and injures a bunch of people, but at least your friend lived, insofar as you prefer your friend. However, an egoist also needs to acknowledge that some people would prefer that 12 other people live, and it would satisfy them and they would feel like a hero if they pull the lever allowing their friend to be killed rather than the 12 strangers. That ultimately, though, it is up to their personal preference. Again, Mills is going to sharply disagree with that and say, no, what is ethical is the largest amount of good for the largest amount of people. Therefore, you egoists are wrong. That by saving your friend and killing others, that is a less ethical action, if not an unethical action, compared to saving your friends, saving the strangers and allowing your friend to die. So that demonstrates the relationship. Egoism and utilitarianism aren't like chocolate and peanut butter. They don't go together terribly well. We can see reflections of one in the other, thinly, not very thickly, but we can see reflections of one in the other when we look at how egoism and utilitarianism have unfolded in our society. If you remember the first chapter of your Critical Issues in Psychology text, Richardson talks about liberal individualism. Liberal individualism is the moral position, the moral philosophy of you are free to be you, to live according to the desires that you have, right? It's very egoistic, that you're living, you're loving, you're desiring, etc. is interior to you, and that all of your behavior is motivated by these internal needs or drives, these needs for satisfaction. Whereas liberal means you're free, and individual means you're an isolate monad. You're not fundamentally morally or otherwise connected to anybody else. However, if people live a life where they're free to do whatever they want, whenever they want, and they go around hurting other people, well, then that is impinging upon the freedom of others. And so therefore, you are free to do whatever you want, egoism, insofar as it doesn't affect other people. Not quite utilitarianism, okay? But you'll notice it's more utilitarian. The liberal individualist position is more utilitarian, that if all of us have freedoms to do what we want and our freedoms don't interfere with one another, it's best overall. We can see shades of utilitarianism within that egoism. So although egoism and utilitarianism as original theories don't seem like they have a lot to do with each other, when we look at liberal individualism today, we see that, so liberal individualism is what happens when egoism and utilitarianism have an illicit one-night stand in Vegas and have this morally ugly baby. It's better than either alone. At the same time, though, we still get to question the worth of that particular moral position, that liberal individualism is both very helpful in some ways. We're all free to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in our individual lives. At the same time, though, it's liberated us from moral obligation to others. If my neighbors are hungry, the only time a liberal individualist says that you should act is if you feel like you should because of your own personally generated reasons and in order to satisfy your own desire to help. But there's nothing fundamental about helping others other than you wish to help. So, again, the baby between egoism and utilitarianism in the form of liberal individualism is a little ugly. At the same time, though, obviously thinkers smarter than me argue that it is the way to go. Okay, so any questions? Nope. Okay, moving on. How can we go about studying psychology and testing theories like we go about studying other sciences when psychology is unique and different compared to other sciences? How come we have to come up with another accurate method to test theories other than the scientific method, some that disregard falsification and causation? Is it possible not to have these present in a testing method? Okay. Let me take that's a lot of bullets you got in that gun question. Okay. So let me take every bullet in turn. How can we go about studying psychology like we go about studying other sciences when psychology, like other sciences, when psychology is unique and different compared to other sciences? Okay. There's so many answers. One is psychology chose its research methods before, as a field, people gathered together and agreed upon what the object of study was. What are human beings? Like psychology, let's break down the word. The logos, the word of the psyche. The psyche means soul, so the word of the soul. What is soul? What word are we speaking to the soul? What word about the soul? What words do the soul speak? Like the logos of the psyche. We don't even have that. We don't even know what the soul is, let alone what the words are. However, at the time, again, this is the time when John Stuart Mills is beginning to write. People at the time are inheriting the legacies of these rationalists, empiricists, and materialists. They were putting together the best science they could under the circumstances they had. And so they proceeded with those observations in those particular situations. Like, look at the psychophysics laboratory of Wilhelm Wundt. He was careful to not try to go into depth as to what was happening in people's heads. He was looking at things like reaction times. It's more psychophysics than it was psychology. Psychophysics is the stimulus response, motor movement, activity, response times, etc. That's psychophysics, like looking at how the nervous system operates in a way where muscles can respond to stimuli. So he generally didn't brainstorm a whole lot compared to the psychophysics that he did about what was going on in the interior of the brain. He was more interested in what was going on in terms of people, handling controls in his scientific simulations. So, how can we go about studying psychology? Well, I would like to argue that psychology talks about itself as a field as though we are a science in the same way geology is, or the same way physics or chemistry is, or biology. And in some cases, I think that my colleague can make that claim in a valid way. Like, when I'm looking at the neural response patterns of a stimulated neuron in a given controlled experiment, that I think that those biological scientific methods are being used in a validly biologically sciencey sort of way. When I'm reading studies about changing client schemas through a cognitive behavioral intervention, then that is altogether a different sort of animal. That those are correlational studies, they're not direct observation studies, and therefore it makes me wonder if we can call them science in the same way we call biology a science. That we want the certainty, the prestige, the money, the power that the scientific label brings us. And because of that, I think we're kind of blinded to the ways in which we're pretty non-scientific. The ways in which our biases go into our study. As you've heard me rant in class, I have yet to see an empirical article where the authors own up front their interest and motivation in the subject matter at hand, and how it is that their interest in that particular subject probably informed the way that study was designed and the conclusions that they reached. Where you need that less when you're just looking at neural response times in a cricket leg in a laboratory. That seems to be a different sort of observation. So why? Because we want certainty and power. How come we have not come up with another accurate method to test theories other than the scientific method? Okay, I have so many responses to that. One is because we're hidebound and loath to change. At the same time, though, change does happen slowly. Earlier in the same running monologue here in my dining room, we had talked about the logical positivism of John Stuart Mill's, right? That he is iterating upon and modifying the empirical scientific philosophies he inherited to instead start setting up a logically positivistic science. So it is unfolding. There's another type of scientific observation called phenomenological or qualitative, where we look at themes across people in their responses to prompts and queries, and we engage in textual analyses of their stories as they're telling us a story of what it is that they're doing and why it is they do it and what it is they experience while they do so. And so we have come up with other methods. The question, and one of the loaded words, is accurate. What do you mean by accuracy? If I sit down with you and ask you the story of your latest breakup, and if I use accurate, meaning all parties involved will tell me exactly the same story of your breakup, well, then the story of your breakup is very inaccurate. If it is how authentic that story was to your experience at the time, then it's extremely accurate. So accurate is a little bit of a loaded word there. And so I would also argue that in psychology, if we take all of us up as psychologists, then all of us are already testing theories all the time, okay? Testing theories about if I write the essay set this way, how will that work? If I talk to my girlfriend in this other way, will she respond better? Because she seemed to be really hurt by when I tried to compliment her and instead she was very offended. Like, what did my friend mean in this seemingly snarky text? Like, we are constantly testing theories, but we do so, the word is phenomenologically. And unfortunately in this class we don't get to explore phenomenology as I would like, because it's a new development in the history of psychology. And that is the meaning of experience itself. And that is a different way of talking about science and a different way of talking about accuracy. That it turns out, from a particular phenomenological point of view, that human behavior and human feeling and being is embedded within a context that presents a nexus of possibilities. And this context informs our experience of it. Like right now, my hips hurt. I thought would be a more comfortable chair than these wooden chairs. Turns out it's not. And that's not the fault of the chair. It's because, as I said, I got these childbearing hips. So there's a particular meaning. I would not be sitting here if it wasn't for the ways in which people are responding to certain situations in certain places, meaning that I got to videotape this from home, or that I was told that if I was going to videotape, I had to do so from home. So it changes what we mean if we take up people phenomenologically. It changes what we mean by falsification and causation. So remember your chapter on like hermeneutic psychology, phenomenological psychology. So I get a text from a friend and it seems snarky. And so I then Marco that friend and say, hey bro, what's up? And he's laughing and joking with some other friends, and I realized that I had taken his text out of context. That's not an empirical event where I'm counting the words and every word has a certain emotional valence that can be empiricized, operationalized, right? Instead, it's all context. And so it turns out my interpretation was false because of the way in which information exists in context. Likewise, causation. Causation is very tricky phenomenologically because with physical objects, A may cause B through space and time, like very Newtonian mechanics, where the billiard ball rolls across the table, hits the 8-ball, which then rolls across and drops into the corner pocket. But human beings do not seem to operate clearly on laws of causality. In fact, quite the contrary. We seem on one hand, as an aggregate, to be a very predictable species, but individually, it's much harder to. So, what causes our behavior, and that is a lot of things simultaneously. A lot of the ways in which we behave are situated within possibilities and constraints. And you'll see this in your last chapter of the critical thinking text. And so we'll revisit this again later in the semester. There's a certain nexus of possibilities that some things are more probable and some less so. So therefore causation isn't clear like it is in Newtonian mechanics. Instead, it seems like causation is, first of all, doesn't exist, that instead it's all a matter of human beings living into and blossoming within some things that constrain certain behaviors and some things that inform certain behaviors or allow for possibilities. So my shifting uncomfortably in this chair is highly probable, given that how badly my hips hurt sitting here. At the same time, though, my chances of whipping off my shirt and doing a dance are extremely low, because of the various possibilities and constraints in this particular relationship in this particular way. So, is it possible to not have these present in a testing method? Yeah, we give up on falsification and causation, or we change what they mean. That what is false in a given context, in a given time, and usually not in a black and white way. It's more false than not. And causation, what caused your last lover to cheat on you isn't any one thing. It's a lot of things, including them, all at once. And so, yeah, we can modify that a fair bit. So it would change what psychology looks like, and we would give up our pretenses, our pretending that we can offer certainties, and instead offer proximities. Now, some of you are saying, Matt, I've taken my research methods class, and everything really gets down to proximity. And I would say yes, and you'll notice that they have cutoffs of what is approximate enough to be published, p less than 0.05, for example. That's very concerning because there's also an issue of what's called practical significance, meaning the way in which a given phenomenon actually directly informs our behavior or even indirectly informs our behavior in a profound way. Meaning that if I were to provide that intervention, it would have an effect more often than not. It's leaving that by the side of the road. So psychologists now come up with effect sizes and things like that, like let's try to do this thing. And there is an appreciation for proximity. At the same time, though, there's also a collapsing of there's a collapsing of specific possibility in the face of general. So I collapse the specific possibilities for me if my behavior is along certain lines and you look at it from a general point of view. And so, well, on average, that behavior, Matt, is aberrant or abnormal or pathological. And yet in this given context, that behavior was called for and might actually be good. So again, it's really complicated. So, another question. I am concerned because before taking this class with you, none of my teachers ever challenged or even brought up the assumptions that the authors of our textbook are eviscerating. Ooh, I love that word. It's a $10 word. Eviscerating. The logic that Williams uses seems so plain and simple, but it literally never even crossed my mind while I was listening to my teachers preach the gospel of empiricism with its measurements, null hypotheses, controlled variables, etc. If Williams' argument is so straightforward, simple, and logical, why isn't it more commonly known? I'm very grateful for this course and for the work of the critical thinking authors, but I still wonder why it's not common knowledge. Well, I'll be blunt. It's the Cartesian neuroses. It's habit and it's money. So the Cartesian neuroses is the need for certainty. You notice that Williams doesn't exactly paint a model of psychology that even has a pretenses. In fact, he doesn't paint a model of psychology at all. He just criticizes what is. And of course, he's not wrong. At the same time, though, what would psychology look like that would that would pass by Williams's criticisms? So that's what we see in the hermeneutic chapters, the whole monad chapters, etc. would be harder for Williams to field his criticisms against. So another part of that is we teach as we were taught. That we gain, let me nuance that a little bit more. If we are given certain things as true, we are not necessarily taught the critical thinking skills by which to critique the thing that we were taught. And therefore, we will continue to teach it. Monkey see, monkey do is one of the strong parts of the field of psychology, right? We're all just monkeys, and we're taught and we learn a certain way, and then we live out and embody that particular learning and that particular meaning. So that's another part of it. And the last part of it is, well, there are very vested interests in keeping the status quo. Imagine how humble a psychologist would have to be to look at his data that his entire career is based on and go, wow, I asked my questions slightly different to my research subjects and I got totally different results when they're about the same subject. And watch your career go up in flames before you. Now, there are a few psychologists who have actually done that, where they have reported on the ways in which the observations change over time on the same phenomena and across different samples. There's an article by Johann Werner that I wish we had time to read this semester. With all the other readings you guys have got going on, I'm not going to add another one to you, but it's entitled "The Truth Wears Off." And Johann is an investigative journalist, and he actually follows some psychologists who are doing just this thing that they're testing against their own studies, that they are testing against their own findings, and they find that over time the effect size, the statistical significance of a given phenomenon that maybe made their career fades over time, and how startling that is for them. That, in fact, again, the truth wears off. Likewise, although Johann doesn't do this as much, there's also similar data coming out of the psychopharmacology industry that these huge effect sizes they see with certain antidepressants at certain times, that the effect size of those antidepressants within the population slowly changes to the point where they become less and less viable. One of the other big research projects we just finished, just got confirmation from the editors today that it's good to go. We did a big study where part of that study is we looked at the way in which psychoactive drugs behave differently in the population over time, to the point where of the 21 or so most commonly prescribed antidepressants and anxiolytics of the SSRI and SNRI variety, when we ask patients, 3 months after they started taking them, if they're still taking them, they commonly only take 8 of the 21. And when we ask why, it's just because they didn't work. They're back to their doctor at the 3-month point saying whatever pill you give. When those same pills, and it's consistently the same 8, when the other 13 pills worked beautifully in the lab, just like that first 8 did. But the effect sizes that we're seeing with those pills wears off over time. So imagine being the one who staked your career on this antidepressant pill, making your company lots of money and guaranteeing your position or a promotion. How hard would it be for you to actually falsify and earnestly seek to falsify, which, as you know, is the whole point of psychology. We don't study the H1, we study the HO, we study the null hypothesis, and it's all about rejecting or failing to reject HO. It's never about accepting H1. That somebody who really endeavors to continually test H1 against HO earnestly and meaningfully is risking their careers. So that's a long-winded answer to a pretty long question. here's a hope that I have, that you'll be one of the critical thinkers, all of you, that you'll be the ones to go through, and that when you read a finding or report in psychology, your first question is, was it replicated and by whom? And your second question is, let's look at the fundamental assumptions that the authors seem to have about this particular phenomenon in question, and then really take it up accordingly, to really look at it deeply. And you'll find that once you've had classes like this one, where you begin to learn the ins and outs of how science is performed as a cultural endeavor, you lose a lot of faith in it. And it'll happen with medicine too. It happens with a lot of things where you have this healthy skepticism. Please, I hope not unhealthy, but you have a healthy skepticism. Like, I kept being told that if I changed my diet, it would change my health. And so I ate a ton of those vegetable things, those generally terrible tasting things that grow out of the ground. I ate far less of my donuts and other things, and the blood markers for my health didn't improve. So I did my own research, and these were physicians telling me these things. And so I took it upon myself, decreased the quantity of what I was eating overall, and lo and behold, my biomarkers got a little bit better. That medicine and the research in medicine, when you look at those, they're oftentimes convenience and observational samples, and not necessarily what a given person needs in a given case. Okay, so I've kept you too long for today. Thank you for letting me go a minute over. And what I will do on Wednesday is continue to work through your very cool questions. So thank you guys. I appreciate you playing along with this indirect and asynchronous way of us having a pseudo conversation.